All right, so I've got a rapid fire section here of CSS features, like new CSS features, and I like to get your take on them. So just quick answers. First, though, mobile first versus desktop first.
Mostly mobile first. But what I tend to say these days is like path of least resistance. So, and that just happens 90% of the time to move mobile first. But if I'm coming in, the example I always use, because it's the one we always have to do, is a mobile navigation, where the mobile version of it's actually a lot more complicated and has a lot more styles in it. So I don't want to have to build that and then overwrite everything to reset it back to the default values. So in that one case, and there's every now and then you're like, oh, this mobile version for whatever reason just has like a bunch of stuff happening where the desktop one's simpler. You can throw a max width media query in there.
So mostly mobile first for layout and desktop first for navigation.
Navigations and maybe a little thing here or there.
Yeah. Okay, all right. Container queries.
Love them. How deep do you want me to go into these?
You can get
a
little snippet.
So they were something that I think we thought were going to like just take over, and they sort of didn't do it. But the momentum's building a little bit in them, and I think that and now that we're realizing the way they're different from media queries, the momentum's building, and we're going to see them used a lot more.
So it's kind of like an education problem.
Yeah,
in a lot of ways. Yeah. Cool. How about cascade layers?
So I like them. I think they're nice for organizing things, which is always good because that's a problem with CSS is always dealing with the cascade. So it gives us more control over it. But it's something there too where I think everyone's still learning the best way to do it. Now that it's at baseline, we can use it. But let's see. Yeah, I think we're at that like early stage of seeing the best way to use them still. And I'm always looking at what other people are doing.
For sure. New emerging kind of standards are coming to play. Yeah, I would think that you don't want to use too many because then it's going to be really difficult to find exactly where that style is being applied. Yeah. The has pseudo-selector.
Yeah, so that's like the big game changer to me. It's because when it was sort of like at first sold as the parent selector, but then it was like, I think they call it the relational selector maybe or something like that, just because you can get the parent that then gets the previous sibling or do like this stuff you can do with it's amazing. I'm so happy we have it.
So what's your like favorite use case?
Ooh, my biggest problem actually with it is because I know we have it, I come up with more complicated solutions sometimes. And like I just had a video come out last week where I did something where I used it, and then the comments, they were like, why didn't you use nth last child instead? And I was like, oh, yeah, that would have worked. And that would have been easier. But my mind didn't go there just because I was like, we have has, and I know that lets me select preceding siblings. So that's what I'm using. I'm trying.
It's almost like CSS has become a programming language in and of itself. And the same problems kind of crop up with programming languages. Like there's a simpler way to do this. And then there's the complicated one that makes you look smart.
Yes, exactly.
And a lot of engineers tend to, at least, sort of in the middle of their career, like go to the complicated one that makes them like look smart rather than the simple one. It's like, How about view transitions?
So view transitions are awesome. I'm so happy we have them. One of the reasons I like those, and I think it's one of the differences between, say, the cascade layers we have, where like that, if the browser didn't support it, it's a breaking change. So we couldn't really use them until browser support got better, which is why they've been around for 2.5 years, and now we're starting to see it because people just didn't want to use it. Whereas view transitions, it's progressive enhancement. If the browser doesn't support it, it doesn't have an animation. So it's not the end of the world. Everything still functions. And like, it's so cool that you can just do one line of CSS and then you get crossfading between pages and then you can fancy it up really easily. And I started planning a video on them. Like I want to do a deep dive, and the one problem I have with them is there's a lot going on. And I was just like, oh my goodness, this is like, how do I actually turn this into something coherent? Because once you get past the basics and you start looking at all the new pseudo element selector things we have with the groups and the classes and the new and the old. And
it's very deep.
Yeah.
So we'll look forward to your video on it when you do get it done. CSS nesting.
Nesting, I'm a big fan of. I was always a big fan of using it in Sass. Previously, I still use Sass for some stuff. So, and now that it's in native CSS, I'm happy that it's there. I know one complaint people always have with it is that it makes things harder to read. Or I think the big thing wasn't even readability, it was more searchability. Because if you saw a selector that was compiled from Sass, that selector isn't in the file. Like you can't Control F or Command F that and find it because it got pre-compiled into a different thing. Now that it's all native, you can use nesting with the ampersand or whatever you're doing, and that selector's live in your code. So I think like the searchability thing is gone. But like anything, just don't overdo it because you can just nest as much as you want. And so,
true.
Yeah, be careful.
I generally find like 2 layers is okay.
Yeah.
Once it starts to get past 2 layers, it gets a little bit. Yeah, it's like 3 in very specific use cases.
Yeah, it's like when you're throwing a hover on there or something. You're
exactly.
like, okay, I'll make an exception.
Yeah, exactly. And then you said you still use Sass for a few things.
Yeah.
What's the holdout?
So I like before in the old days, I made like a Sass starter that I used for my projects. So it uses maps and loops and if else statements and other stuff like that, and mix-ins. And so I have like my map of colors or font sizes that it will loop through, turn those into custom properties, and turn them into utility classes and other stuff that I can do with it. So it's like, as long as I still have that, and I know there's other tooling that does similar stuff these days, but since it works for me, I just kept using it.
Makes sense. Scroll-driven animations.
Yeah, that's another one of my favorite new things. A little bit like the view transitions, they can be a progressive enhancement, which is cool. And it's one of those things for like, I'm biased because I'm a CSS guy because it's like, well, we could do a lot of that with like intersection observers. And like, I learned intersection observers just because I wanted to do all that. And I made videos on it. And like, this is how we have to do it. And now I can just do it with CSS. So that makes me very happy.
Sweet. Yeah. Anchor positioning.
Yeah, every one you're listing is like, oh yeah, that's awesome. There's so many cool things happening in CSS now. Anchor positioning is, I think, a lot of that's like, out of everything you've listed, that's probably the one that once browser support's good enough is going to have the fastest adoption because it solves so many real world problems that people fight with constantly. So just even like tooltips that you need your tooltip to open on wherever you need it to, but it's an element somewhere else. You can anchor it to there. So it's attached to that element. But then it doesn't have space on the page and it just moves to the other side because it has the room over there instead. And you don't need a third-party JavaScript library to figure all that out or reinvent the wheel. Like, yeah, it's pretty cool.
Sweet. Scoping.
That's one that I'm trying to wrap my mind around still. I think that's going to be one that takes a while to get adoption again because if the browser doesn't support it, it just breaks. But I think it's something, and it's weird because when you first look at it, you're like, oh, it's sort of like scope styles within some of the JavaScript frameworks where you're just scoping it to that thing. But then you're like, you can have end states as well. So like, even though you're in an element, you're like telling it to go like up until like, don't go inside of a paragraph that's inside of that element. Like it gets more complicated pretty quickly. But yeah, I think it'd be handy and it's something that people have wanted for a long time.
Yeah, it seems like more for dynamic elements, like if you're pulling in something like a module or something like that, it seems like that's the primary use case. But yeah, we haven't really seen any of that in the real world. So it's like, we'll see how it, works out, pans out. Subgrid. Yeah,
I championed Subgrid for a long time. And when Firefox first added it 5-6 years ago, whenever it was, and then no one else did for like 4 years, that taught me a lesson for my YouTube videos of don't talk about features until 2 browsers have supported it. Because I was like, no one's ever talking about this again. I'm really happy it's there. It definitely has fallen into more of a niche thing. I was so excited about it, and there's definitely really cool use cases for it. But it's hard if you're working like a component-based environment, just because you need it's the interaction between like the outer layer and the inner layer almost. So for some things, it's a little bit tricky. But
yeah, it's interesting because you said like you championed Subgrid. I think I remember seeing those early videos and being like, okay, this guy is teaching stuff that'll come way in the future, and like,
talking about way in the future,
and now it's way in the future. Now we finally have it. But yeah, it seems to be a sane limit. It's like, okay, well, 2 browsers support it. Now I'm going to make a video on it.
Yeah, then at least it's
for sure. Yep. On that note, masonry.
Yeah, masonry was one where it's like, oh yeah, this is like when, again, Firefox did it a long time ago, and they didn't fully implement it, but it was sort of to show like how it's working. And it was so simple that you just did it and it worked. And you're like, this is cool. But it's weird now because I don't know if the people listening know, but there's like this battle of two worlds going on with, should it be a new display type or do we have it as part of grid? And it's interesting because it's split into the Google versus Safari camps, which it's not Google versus Safari, but it sort of has become framed that way just because each one is on a different side. And it's the first time I think that we're seeing, because usually what happens if there's like anything going through the spec, one of the browsers will prototype it and then you get it. And that's why like Chrome often has the feature first because they were the one to prototype it. So once it's approved, well, they have it ready to go. This is the first time I can think of where two browser engines are like prototyping differing
completely.
Yeah. And if you if you look in the spec right now for it, it actually has both. Like you can look at the two versions of it in the spec because they don't know what the option is. But it's good in the sense that they're trying to get it right. Like it's better that they take the time to figure it out, but it's a lot of energy going into this.
Yeah. Versus having just like one kind of driving force.
Yeah.
Now we have two driving forces.
Yes, yeah.
And we'll see
who wins. Yeah.
see how it works. And not that it's a CSS feature, but I have to ask because everyone's going to do it. And what's your opinion on Tailwind?
Yeah. My quick answer is I get why people like it, but it's not for me. I went into like I went from being like the biggest proponent of BEM. Like I loved BEM. I was all in with it. And then slowly but surely I sort of had a few things that like, oh, it's kind of annoying for some stuff. A utility class here or there would be really useful. And they sort of snuck into how I was doing things. And then eventually I sort of, like I said, with my SAS thing, I was generating a bunch of utility classes and I went really far the other way. And now I've sort of pushed back into the middle a little bit. I mean, I enjoy authoring CSS. Like I like it. So, but there's parts of it I see why people like it. But part of the issue I have, because I teach a lot of beginners, is you get people that are just like, they see it being used for whatever. So they just start using it and they don't understand CSS well enough. So they're trying to understand what's wrong with Tailwind or what they're doing wrong, but then it's because they don't understand CSS. And then you get people just doing it with like vanilla HTML, which is not meant for. Like when you just get like this wall, like if you're doing a component, it sort of you can make an argument for it there at least. But if you're just writing vanilla, I don't see how it works.
I think it's just an age-old, problem. Like back in the jQuery days, it's like, do I use jQuery? Do I use not? And then React and not, and Tailwind and not. It's like the tool exists and it solves problems, but when you try to have it solve problems it's not perfectly fit for, then ultimately you got to kind of peel back the layers and understand what's going on under the hood and maybe, write it yourself. It's just, it's kind of like an age-old dilemma. So I don't want to belabor it too much. Are there any features that I left out that you can think of?
You did a really good list there.
Okay.
Yeah, that was pretty good.
All right, sweet. All right. And then, just generally, like, what's your background? Like, where did you kind of get started into your first forays into code?
Yeah. My very first forays into code were late 90s high school. I would make like designs in Photoshop and slice them up and turn them into websites. The only one I can remember, I don't know if it was the first one I did, probably not, but the only one I remember that I actually did was for a Star Wars RPG that I was part of, where like for some reason we wanted a landing page to go to the forum we were using. I don't know why, but we did. And so I remembered that project pretty clearly. But it was a weird thing because I sort of did it as this on again, off again hobby for a really long time, and never saw it as a career path until like.
Was that forum in PHP by the chance?
Probably.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
That came to mind.
Yeah.
It's just like, I remember all these forums.
Yeah.
And that was like kind of a fun age because I actually learned web development largely in part due to these like PHP BB forums. It was like webmaster community and people were like sharing how they built websites. It was like great.
Yeah, it was so different back then to like figure anything out because there was no resources. You're just finding out from someone else or like inspecting, and just it wasn't even inspecting. You're just looking at the source, and it was interesting.
Yeah, there was that whole debate on like view source, and now we can't view source because everything's like JavaScript and whatever. And yeah, I don't know. Anyways, I don't want to get down that debate. So, and then you sort of, it was on and off again. And like, when was it that you first got paid to code?
So I really quickly ended up going to school I got a degree in film. I got a bachelor's in urban planning. Didn't get into that. So went back to school for print design. Was working as a print designer and needed more money because I wasn't paid enough. And so I started doing freelance work on the side. And most of the freelance stuff I was doing was UI website design stuff.
Yeah.
And because I was like, well, if they're going to pay me to make the look of it, maybe they'll also pay me to code it. I think I could figure that out because I've been on again, off again, playing with websites. And then, I got a paying client and realized I didn't really know what I was doing, but I figured it out and got it working. And actually, my early days and I think I didn't realize it at the time, but looking back, I think the reason that CSS became like what I fell in love with is a lot of what I was doing was that because I was doing WordPress child themes. I was using the Genesis framework, and I'd basically start with their starter basic theme, delete the CSS file, and then like I had the design. Let's see if I can make that now, starting from a blank CSS file with this there, and then learning PHP and other stuff through that too.
Yeah, I think I started like in a somewhat similar way. Like I thought I was going to be a designer, and so like I made these beautiful designs, and it was like, okay, well, who's going to make it work? And like I'd like plunk some of the graphics into like Dreamweaver, and then it was like, well, it kind of got it there. Like I can hit publish and it kind of works, but doesn't really work the way it needs to be. So it was like, let's look into code view. And it was like kind of like over time figuring out how to, make various pieces of it, like really behave the way that I wanted it to, not just aesthetically, but like also like functionally. So sounds like a similar path.
Definitely. Yeah.
And then, so you like continue to freelance then?
So I was doing the freelancing for a while and working at that design job still. And then realized that I preferred the code over that. And I was sort of at a crossroads at one point because I needed a new job. And then it was the school that I went to for design needed new teachers, and they reached out to me to ask if I'd be interested. And I had no ambition ever in my life to be a teacher, but the pay was decent and I needed something that paid more. So I said, I'll apply and see what happens. And it just so happened that the curriculum had got updated like 6 months earlier, and they added a bunch of web classes, or not a bunch, but they added some web classes, and it was a whole bunch of old print teachers that had no idea. There was one teacher who basically was doing it all and he didn't really like it. So they're like, there was me and one other new teacher that just got like, go teach this because you guys know it. And
nice.
So,
So you like found your niche. You're like, I like to write code. And then you got this teaching job that was like exactly, and you were able to bring your like professional skills that you gained from like freelancing and all that kind of stuff into the like traditional education environment. Yeah,
exactly.
That's pretty sweet.
And it did also make me realize though that like in knowing how to do something is very different from understanding how it works. Because the first time you're up there trying to explain something, I was just like, oh my goodness, I don't know. Or you explain it and you think you did a decent job, and then they're either staring at you blankly or they ask a question that you just have, that's a really good question. I have no idea.
Yeah, you definitely get to test your real understanding.
Yeah.
But that's why I think it's important to have like professional experience or professional context like before teaching, because it's like you can always figure out how to teach better, but like if you don't have the skills to start,
right? Yes.
It's a lot more difficult to find the skills than it is to like figure out how to teach better.
Yes.
Over time. And how many years did you end up teaching?
I think it was 5.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good amount of time. Yeah. And then is that like how you kind of transitioned into like content creation, that kind of thing?
So I started the YouTube channel, I think after 3 years of teaching as a hobby project, maybe after 2. My timeline might be a little wrong, but
and this is like almost maybe a decade ago, right?
I must have started teaching. I'm really bad with dates.
Sure. No,
the YouTube channel's 8 years old now. So 8 plus. So 13, 14 years ago when I was teaching. And then, I started the YouTube channel 8 years ago as a hobby project just because I thought it was interesting, and I was getting bored with, because I had the same 2 classes I was teaching over and over, and it was like the first week of the class was like, here's where the squiggly brace is on your keyboard. Like they just had no idea. They never had done anything, which is really cool, because that's when you see like the progress they make in those early days is really like, they're like, wow, look, and like they got Hello World in the browser or whatever, and they're so excited for it, or they changed the color to blue. But after a few years of that, I was like, okay, I'm going to like forget everything. So I just wanted to like have an excuse for myself to like talk about other stuff and do other things on the side. Yeah. Because I was trying to freelance for a while still, and it was just, I couldn't do it because teaching is a lot of work.
So it's kind of like a creative outlet, because you're like, all right, day job, a little bit boring.
Yep.
Like let's try this YouTube thing. And that's still like pretty early on for YouTube standards, I feel like. Like there wasn't a lot of like tech.
There wasn't too much.
The channel at that time.
There was the New Boston, Brad Traversy.
Yeah.
And the channel that inspired me the most was called Dev Tips. I don't know if you knew that one.
No.
So there was Travis who did that one, and he ran, I don't know if he did it for like 2 or 3 years, but it was very much in like just HTML, CSS, maybe sprinkle in some JavaScript. And I'm like, oh, if you can have a channel that's like that, like I can talk about that stuff. Like that's my comfort zone. Let's go.
Yeah.
And he was just winding the channel down, and I was like, missing a little bit. Like, that was where I was getting sort of some of that. Like, like I really liked his content, and like he was winding that down. So I'm like, oh, maybe I'm gonna like, fill the void by making my own stuff instead. Yeah.
And you've always stuck to just HTML and CSS. I'm sure you've had pressure to kind of like go into the other areas over the years. Like, how have you kind of like wrestled with that?
I get lots of comments of people like asking React or whatever's hot at the time, or just React,
because you've been around for 8 years.
Yeah, exactly.
So you've seen probably many different libraries come and go, and these kinds of things. Yeah.
One thing that's, I started it as a hobby project, and it was really like, I really didn't care if anyone was watching it. So I just wanted to do what I enjoyed. And then once it actually got traction, which took a really long time. But
like how many years are you thinking?
The first 6 months, I think I had 100 subscribers.
Okay.
Then the first year was probably like 5,000 at the most. And that was weekly videos.
That's a lot of dedication for very
little payoff. Yeah, I remember like when it would be like 100 views, you're like, yeah. But at the same time, I was teaching in the classroom where it was like 30 students. So if a video had 100 views, I was
that's
like, oh,
more than what you did for your day job.
Yeah. And then, so I started it doing what I wanted to do. And then when the channel actually gained traction, it sort of just reinforced, like, I can just keep on doing this.
Mm-hmm.
And it's what I enjoy, and I'm not going to enjoy talking about these other things. So, and at the same time, there's a few other channels that do CSS stuff, but it's not their focus. So I'm like, there's so many channels doing really good content on basically everything else that I was like, just go watch one of them. Like they're really good. They know it better than I do. And I'd rather, like, anytime I do go out of my comfort zone, because I'm learning something, so I want to talk about it. Like the amount of time it takes me to make one of those videos is so much more, just because I need to make sure it's good. And so it just takes so much more research and so much more double checking and making sure it's perfect. Whereas, I try and make all of my content perfect, but I'm a lot more confident the first time around if it's in the topics I know well. Yeah.
Yeah. Like digging deep into this niche of CSS. It's like, you're the CSS guy. And then also, like, I saw you recently, you like quizzed AI, like all the AIs on CSS is like, better CSS better than the AIs do. So it's like, you don't really have to double check too much. That was a pretty sweet video.
Thank you.
That was awesome. Yeah, I had the same experience. Like Claude was just like kicking all of the
other ones. It's so much better,
especially with CSS.
Yeah.
So that was interesting. And then like, at what point did you go from like, okay, I'm teaching, to like, oh wow, maybe I can make a job out of this?
Yeah, it went from definitely like hobby project to like date night money, like every like 6 months, like, oh, we get to
honey, go have a steak.
I got my $200 payout from YouTube for the last 6 months of work. Let's go. So that was the early days, and then for a very long time considered it like, oh, this is just going to be like a nice little side gig. It's a nice little extra, maybe eventually be vacation
it's a creative
money or
outlet,
something.
and you're getting a little bit of money on the side.
Yeah. So I'm like, this is pretty cool. I'll keep it up. And then it was it was just before COVID happened. The channel started really growing. I had just like a few videos that did really well. And YouTube's funny because like a lot of people assume the growth is really just like the hockey stick, but I know for me and a few other creators that I talk with, it's more like steps. Like you have one video that can take off, and it just sort of like raises the base viewers you have, and then you'll sort of like, you might go up or you might go down, and it sort of trucks along, and then you get like, another few really good videos, and then you get this next step up. So I had a few earlier steps, and then probably like 3-4 months before COVID, there was a nice bump, and then COVID, just because everyone was home, sort of pushed everything up. I was still teaching then, but then I was teaching from home, which sucks.
Yeah.
But I was at vocational school. I'm teaching adults, so like it was pretty hands off because it would be like, here's your lesson. If you have questions, call me. Like I'm here all day to like take your questions, and I'll jump in if you like. Here's the schedule for. I'll do a demo at this time to cover some stuff. So I was like, I just put more time into the YouTube then at the same time. And then if it was just from YouTube, I never would have been able to go full time with it. But I started making courses as well. And the courses are what enabled me to be able to.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And then you're doing a front-end master's course here soon. So everybody take a look at that as well. And then do you have any like advice for people who are like sort of getting into maybe content creation? They're thinking, hey, I want to try this out.
Yeah. First of all, if anyone's listening and they just want like questions, anything direct, like just DM me wherever. I like helping people with that. For me, it was like a super slow growth thing. I think I've learned a couple of things just by accident as I've gone through it all. The main thing for me, I know it's worked, is consistency. I give that a lot of credit. As I said, I've been doing weekly videos for a really long time. But don't burn yourself out either. Like if you have a day job, like I took a month off every now and then just because work was busy or the kids, whatever was going on. And like, so don't become a slave to it, and make sure that it's something that you enjoy, like a topic that you like. Because especially for me, like it's 8 years now, and people are like, do you plan on doing anything else? It's 8 years of CSS. Like I think it's 850 videos now. It's crazy.
Wow.
Yeah. And I'm like, well, you had that list of things you were just talking about. So I'm like, it's good timing for me to be like doing CSS creation because I'm so excited about the new things that are coming. But I know some creators that happens to where like they just get bored of the topic that they're talking about because that was what they were having fun with then. So like, let's make some videos on it, which is fine. You can shift, you can have fun with it. And I guess it's also set expectations. Do you want it to be something that is going to be huge, or do you like, or is it a hobby, or is it something in between that you want to turn into a side
gig? Define your version
of
success kind of thing. Yeah.
I think that's important. And then just looking at what other people are doing. There's obviously YouTube's a lot more saturated now than ever, but it's always going to keep going that way. But I've also noticed they're doing a much better job at surfacing smaller creators. I'll get like videos in my feed that have like 37 views, and sometimes I'll click on it just to see what it is and stuff. And so I think, they're not prioritizing the big creators. So it's, people still have a chance at least.
Yeah, I actually have seen that where there's like a creator with, millions of subscribers or something like that. But then you have like a small creator that it seems they're like outperforming the bigger creator that's been there for a long time. I've seen that rarely, but it seems like YouTube might be prioritizing like something different these days.
I do. There is that. And there's part of it's like, especially these days, subscriber count is very much a vanity stat for us creators.
Sure,
it doesn't have the same. At one point, the algorithm was so focused on like that's how you got your views, whereas now it doesn't. It's more based on what the content people are actually like. If you watch 3 videos of someone, it's going to keep pushing their content to you.
Sure.
Whether or not you've subscribed. So, but yeah, I think it's important just to have an idea of what you want to do, and I think experimenting and just like you make mistakes early on and just don't be scared to hit publish because that's really hard to do.
Yeah, for sure. And then like a content theme that I've seen through your videos and whatever is like this focus on the fundamentals. Like Can you give us a pitch on why focus on the fundamentals?
Yeah. A big reason I do that is just the amount of problems I've seen people run into where they're fighting. It used to be Bootstrap was the big one because that was what everyone was using. And then they couldn't style something the way they wanted to because it was the conflict they were running into with Bootstrap. And then if you've understood the way, how CSS works at the fundamentals, it would have been really easy to solve it. And then you see it's a different thing with Tailwind, just because Tailwind's not like pre-styled things the way Bootstrap was, but you still see that people are like throwing all of these things at something, just hoping, like throwing mud at the wall and hoping it sticks. And if you just understood a few, like
important.
Yeah. And it's also going to get worse now with scope and with layers and like all these nesting, like you could easily go down a really bad habits and cause some problems. So, but it's, I think with anything, like if you're, even for someone who's like learning JavaScript, like if you're learning, and I learned JavaScript, I learned jQuery before I got into JavaScript because it was easier and that's what everyone was doing and I got it. So if somebody learns React first, I think it's fine. Like I'm not going to gatekeep or anything like that. But I think if you can go back and learn just the core language, then if you're jumping into another framework, it's probably going to be easier. And there's always that thing of like, if you go into React first or Tailwind or whatever, like what you're doing, is it React or is it JavaScript that you're writing? And you don't know because you just learned that. So like, again, there's nothing wrong with that being your first steps into it, but I think it's always worth going back and learning what it's built on, and trends change and everything changes. So it's, if all of a sudden some new framework comes along, it's easier to pivot, I think.
I think even if you're a React developer, let's face it, like React itself has changed.
Oh, yeah.
The ecosystem around it's changed. So I think like that's the case no matter what. Even if you're picking React and using React all day, like, things change on top of that. And so, like understanding the fundamentals under the hood, understanding the fundamentals of React itself, like it's going to help you no matter what. So, I 100% agree with you there. Anything that you are excited about, either career-wise or personal, kind of on the horizon?
Yeah.
Maybe.
I think the big thing for me right now, like this was the first year I got out of my house and explored the world. I did some conference talks this year for the first time, coming here, talking with you, meeting people face to face. So it's a bit of a pivot for me on from like the career perspective, which has been really good and refreshing. I think it's something I needed a little bit. Like, I like being alone in my office and just having my own space. It's fantastic. But every now and then, breaking free and making actual connections with real people, like you're like, oh yeah, this is actually kind of good and you should do it sometimes. So I'm enjoying that. And then I think that I can't think of anything on a personal level that's going on right now, but
I think like the last question is like, are there any themes that kind of tie your career together, like something that you've always done from 13 years ago to today that kind of just always seemed to work out for you?
My it's hard for me for that because I sort of feel like I got here by accident. And like I was talking with a few people at one of the conferences and I was saying something about, just I've sort of like fallen to here, like, and they're like, well, you've obviously like, you're almost saying it like it's like a negative, like, but you've obviously done something right. So like, don't say it in a way that like is negative, in the sense that like if you've been doing it and doing it right for long enough and people are obviously appreciating it. But I just think I guess I lucked into finding something for me that I enjoy doing and just get to do it every day all the time. And it can become a slog a little bit sometimes, but then, I'm lucky with the type of work I'm doing and everything right now. I'm pretty happy with it.
So in other words, you just kind of like, I'll try this. I'll try this. I'll try this. And then it seemed to like,
I eventually found the right thing. Yeah. Is this like, and I'm like, when I started the channel, I honestly didn't think it would be something that I would continue with, because I'm very much the type of person who likes to start a new hobby figure it out and then find something else. It drives my wife nuts because I end up spending money on things, and I'm like, oh, that was fun. What else can I do now?
I'm sure there was something before making beer.
Yes.
And something before that and something before that, like trying
different
hobbies.
And then like sometimes different things stick, and I did it with my career or school. Like I tried film, tried urban planning, tried design, and eventually got to where I found something that actually stuck. So yeah, it took a while, but I'm happy that it finally did stick.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, I think that's a good place to wrap up. So thanks for coming on the podcast, Kevin.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Cheers. Hey, while you're here, I hope you enjoyed the podcast episode, and don't forget to leave a subscribe on our YouTube channel, a follow on Spotify podcasts or Apple podcasts. Leave us a review. And if you want to support the show, head to frontendmasters.com and check out our courses.